Greetings one and all. I'd like to do some more about Maurice Nicoll because I was recently talking to someone about self-observation and struggling to explain it. And of course the best person to explain it would be Gurdjieff, Ouspensky or Maurice Nicoll. So I'm going to read this piece from Maurice Nicoll, and this was given on the 16th of July 1949. We speak about self-observation. This is one of the central practices of the work. Unless you practice self-observation, the work is useless to you. You may have diagrams in different colours and all the rest of it, but unless you begin to observe yourself, it is all useless. Now, you have all heard of self-observation. Yes, that is quite true, but it is merely in your external memory, i.e. informatory centre. You can hear the work many times and begin to think it is nothing but constant repetition of the same thing. To the formatory centre and its memory, this is quite true. It is the same thing said in so many words over and over again. If you are superficial, you may imagine that you understand the work simply because you remember, for example, that self-observation is necessary and is, in fact, the starting point of the fourth way teaching. But have you begun to practice self-observation in regard to yourself? If not, you will never understand why the work begins with self-observation. Your external memory, i.e. the memory belonging to the purely formatory part of the intellectual centre, will not change you. It is only when you apply the knowledge of the work to yourself that the work can change you. First of all, you have to receive the work in the external memory. But if you leave it there, nothing will happen. The work has to become emotional. It has to affect the emotional part. Otherwise, as I said, it simply remains in the formatory part. But it has to begin with the formatory part. This means that you have to know the work in the external memory or formatory part of yourself, but understanding depends on the work of at least two centres. The formatory part is merely a recorder of what you have heard. It has the teaching of the work, but this teaching of the work on the blackboard might be compared with water. Our task is to turn this water into wine. Now, if you begin actually to practice self-observation, you are beginning to turn water into wine. But in order to do this, we have to realize that the knowledge of the work formatorily is not enough. All the ideas of the work can become living if you practice them, if you apply them to yourself. As usual, I will ask you the same question. Have you observed yourself today? You must understand that mechanical man does not observe himself, and you may have a mechanical man who even knows the work formatorily and regards himself as rather a professor of the whole subject, and yet he has never practised a single iota of it. He has never thought of actually observing himself. That it has never occurred to him that the ideas he has received in his formatory part have to be applied practically to himself. In short, it has never occurred to him to observe himself. For example, let us take an imaginary person who is full of envy. Of course, as a mechanical man, he will deny that he is ever envious, although perhaps other people are quite aware of it. Suppose people say to this hypothetical person that he or she is very envious. What would be the result? The result would be a flare-up and a denial. So the work says that it is only through realizing these things from self-observation that a man can begin to change. He has to see for himself that he is envious. But if he observes that he is envious, do you see what happens to him? He's begun to become aware of himself. He has begun to see for himself without any compulsion that he is full of envy, and that his whole life perhaps has been governed by this unpleasant, narrowing, negative emotion. But no force on earth coming from out will make him realize that this is the chief block to his inner development. Now the work says that self-observation is to let a ray of light into our inner darkness. What is this inner darkness? All that we take for granted that we are, all our pictures of ourselves, all the roles we play automatically in life, all the self-justifying that prevents us from seeing what we really are like. This is our inner darkness, the person that we don't see and never suspect ourselves of being. Remember that you are not what you imagine you are. What you imagine you are is called in the work imaginary I. Remember that all esoteric teaching says that we do not know ourselves. The work says that in place of self-knowledge we have imaginary I, i.e. an imagination about ourselves that does not correspond with what we are or how we really behave. Now what is this ray of light that is let into our inner darkness through practicing self-observation? This ray of light is consciousness. If an envious man through self-observation becomes conscious that he is envious, his consciousness has increased. But if he takes himself for granted and justifies himself, his consciousness remains at a mechanical level, which means practically that he remains asleep towards himself. The object of self-observation is to increase consciousness, because if it is emotional, the man becomes conscious of the fact that he is envious and his position is infinitely better than it was before. Why? Because his consciousness has increased. He has become conscious of himself as envious. And this instantly means that he can begin to work on his envy and perceive it acting, whereas before he was unconscious of this factor in himself. The work says that without self-observation, no one can shift from where he is. Everyone is at a certain level, and to shift from that level, a man must become more conscious of himself through self-observation. Of course, a man of small being cannot observe himself because he will not be able to stand it. But the good householder who has magnetic centre will be able to do so. Tramps, lunatics, self-satisfied people, self-complacent people, people who have no sense of anything greater than themselves, will not be able to observe themselves. The possession of magnetic centre means that a man, a woman who are good householders are aware even before they have met this work that there is something greater than themselves. But a very small, envious man will not be able to admit that there is anything greater than his own self-emotions, self-liking, self-love. Now, a man who begins to observe something in himself begins to separate from it. Taking yourself for granted as being quite all right means that you are completely identified with yourself. Of course, you are not selfish. Of course, you do not always want your own way, and so on. But once you begin to observe yourself rightly, you become divided into two. Observing I observes you, and feels itself different from you. This is the starting point of this work. I can, for example, observe myself as being envious without knowing it. I took myself envying as myself without realizing for a moment that it was envy. But now I can see myself envying as distinct from my observing I. In short, I have established something in myself that is not my ordinary self. In that case, I can make room for other people in the sense that, seeing and knowing my own envy, I am not criticizing them as I would if I only found fault with them for being envious and judged them without seeing my own envy. Now, when you can observe yourself up to a certain point, you attract the influence of the work, which has a great power to change you. This power of the work begins to act on observing I, if you have noticed the diagram, not on Nicoll in my case, but on observing I. This builds up deputy steward, and finally attracts real I or master. You must understand, in speaking to people in life who have never observed themselves, one finds after a time certain difficulties because they do not understand what one is talking about. In short, they take themselves for granted and justify everything they do, never observing themselves. They are full of criticism of others, as all people in life are. That is one of the difficulties that face us all in the work. Now, the more you have observed in yourself, the less do you judge others, the less you find fault with your neighbour. And this is the beginning of love thy neighbour as thyself, not in any sentimental sense, but in a real way. So that was Maurice Nicoll, as I say, from 1949. And I found it quite interesting that he was talking about how we are working towards becoming more conscious, which is something someone left a comment on one of my videos about recently, that the Gurdjieff work is about becoming more conscious, which it is indeed. But as Nicoll says here, this becoming more conscious also makes you realise that there's something more to the world than just your little self when you are being mechanically asleep. You're not observing yourself. When you start observing yourself, you start having more of a connection with the planet, your surroundings, the universe, and then hopefully that will lead you to understanding that there's something more out there. And self-observation, when I first started doing this myself many, many years ago, I did try to self-justify many of my acts and what I was doing, and justifying why I was like this or justifying why I was like that, you know, in a way that was being very mechanical. Yet there was a niggling feeling always behind me saying, you know, you're just trying to justify yourself. Actually look at yourself and admit who you really are, what you've really done, or try to see who you're really being. That person is not the person that's the real you. It's someone who's being obviously mechanical, but at the same time, why am I being like that? And stop trying to justify for being a fool, really, because we're all fools. So observing myself was a hard task at first, and I wouldn't say it became easier, but it became more the more I've observed myself, self-observation. I began to get to know myself better and my different eyes, and recognise when certain eyes were popping up and when certain other eyes popped up and then disappeared again because they suddenly realised they'd done something that maybe they shouldn't have. And I tried to see that I was trying to justify myself. It's very interesting observing yourself. But one thing with my life which I find quite relevant to this passage was I've never been self-satisfied. So maybe that was why I was able to observe myself. If you remember the line that Nicoll was saying about tramps and lunatics, maybe I was a lunatic, self-satisfied people, self-complacent people, people who have no sense of anything greater than themselves will not be able to observe themselves. Well, since I was a child, always sensed there was something greater than myself out there, so maybe that was why I was able to start self-observing myself and my actions. And when I look at the people that are in the work, or people that I've met over the last few years that have been trying to obviously work on themselves, I notice they aren't these kinds of people. They are people that are genuinely trying to find their way in life, find out what more there is, because they sense that there's something greater than themselves. And when I do certain reading groups or meetings of some kind, there is the odd person who comes along who might be self-complacent, but once they get talking, you suddenly realise, or they come to the realisation that they are not as self-complacent as they thought, and that they are quite rocked by life deep down. They're just putting up a cover to try and justify being okay. We all want to be okay, we all want to be normal, we all want to fit in. But this is the thing about doing this kind of work or following these kinds of paths. It's because you've realised that normality is not quite what we're being told it is. And because we're beginning to see that life is not what we're told it should be, or as Gurdjieff would name it, the lunatic asylum, we see that we're living in this lunatic asylum. We don't want to be one of those lunatics, so we are trying to right ourselves so that we can rise ourselves above it in a way. And rising ourselves above it also then takes you hopefully further out into the universe anyway of what's really going on. That sounds a bit crazy, that what I've just said, but rising yourself above all the lunatic asylum again sounds quite big-headed, doesn't it? Oh, we're better than them. We're not better than them. We're just waking up where they're all quite happy to still be asleep. And it is difficult to wake people up. As Maurice Nicoll says here, you must understand, in speaking to people in life who have never observed themselves, one finds after a certain time difficulties because they do not understand what one is talking about. In short, they take themselves for granted and justify everything they do, never observing themselves. And then he goes on to say they are full of criticism of others, but they find it very difficult to criticise themselves or look at what they've done. Maybe they will at some point later in life. You know, we feel like people are being left behind. I myself wanted to wake everybody up, as many of you do. I have many emails about this. Many people message me about, oh, we've got to help wake everybody up. The most important thing is to wake yourself up first. You need to get yourself looked at by self-observing to see who you are so that you can become a more balanced person. And as you're doing this work, as again Nicoll says, the possession of magnetic centre means that a man or woman who are good household holders are aware even before they have met this work that there is something greater than themselves. You're working towards that something greater than yourself. And I know this has touched a few corns or trodden on a few corns of people because of the comments I've been receiving and an email I got from someone. This is an esoteric path. This is about connecting with the divine, not just with yourself, because our role is to work with the divine at some point once we've started to wake up and fall into our roles that we should be doing, rather than just going along mechanically living in the lunatic asylum. Otherwise it's just you yourself waking up, doing it for yourself, and that's kind of egoistic. And if I take us back to the beginning of this piece from Maurice Nicoll, he talks about being superficial. Do you want to be superficial? It's saying if you are superficial, you may imagine that you understand the work simply because you remember, for example, that self-observation is necessary and is, in fact, the starting point of the fourth way teaching. But have you begun to practice self-observation in regard to yourself? And I've spoken to people over the years who are always looking for someone, a teacher, to show them the way. And I understand that. I wanted a teacher to show me the way. And I've been lucky. I've met a few people that have helped me with my self-observation and progress. But when there's not one around, you have to do it yourself. And this is part of the work. It's self-work. We do tend to be a little bit gentle with ourselves, but we can also be very harsh on ourselves. And that can be quite damaging, either way. Instead, you're trying to observe yourself in an impartial way. Remember, impartiality is one of the most important words in the Gurdjieff work, or one of many of the important works in the Gurdjieff work. Being impartial, but also being genuine, and being truthful to yourself. And Maurice Nicoll had said, it is only when you apply the knowledge of the work to yourself that the work can change you. Well, that is all part of the being truthful to yourself and being genuine to yourself. And I suppose when we do start off just by working kind of superficially, I do say practice makes perfect, but what am I trying to say here? As we read or learn about these different exercises that we should be doing on ourselves, at first it is kind of becomes a bit of a mechanical rote, but after a while, if you put effort in, another important work, the effort will then make it more real and more true. You start letting the teaching work on you. At first you're reading it, you're trying to understand it, can practice observation on other people and how they act and react to things, and then see that in yourself. But as Maurice Nicoll says, but in order to do this, we have to realise that the knowledge of the work formatorily is not nearly enough. All the ideas of the work can become living if you practice them, if you apply them to yourself. And that's what we're trying to do, make the work live in us. We should be living that, hopefully in a more wakeful state. Because this is what, again, it's all about, isn't it? What state are you in? And as Maurice Nicoll then goes on to say, as usual, I will ask you the same question. Have you observed yourself today? Looking at yourself is very revelatory. Hopefully in the best way for you. Try not to be too harsh on yourself, yet at the same time be critical, but understand that what you're doing is for the betterment of yourself. So thank you all for watching this little video. Maurice Nicoll has great psychological commentaries to read if you can get the books. I know sometimes they're quite hard to get or very expensive. And of course, definitely read Gurdjieff's writings. I would say to quite a few people that send me emails or comments about certain things, I do often reply back, have you read Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson, or even Ouspensky's book In Search of the Miraculous? That should be the first book you read if you're coming newly to Gurdjieff's writings and work. And then, of course, there are my own books out there. If you're needing a book to read, some fiction, my books are available at Amazon. Tesla and Twain, about Nikola Tesla and Mark Twain and their friendship. Monkey Mind, Robot Body, my book about what I see is coming with transhumanism and how it's going to divide humanity. Exercising Witches, about the priest who can see the demons that we all have in us. So all my own fiction, I try to put my own ideas of how we can help wake ourselves up in them as well, and be more observant. So once again, thank you for listening. I'd like to thank Maurice Nicoll for his writings, and of course Mr. Gurdjieff himself. Until next time, peace and out.